The August sun hung like a molten coin in the bleached sky, bearing down on the parched earth of West Texas with the weight of God's own anvil. Heat waves shimmered across the endless expanse of scrub brush and prickly pear, distorting the horizon until sky and land merged into one wavering line of torment. A lone buzzard circled overhead, its ragged wings cutting through air so thick it seemed to resist every movement. Dusty McKenna pulled his hat lower against the glare and wiped the sweat from his 3-day stubble. His horse, a sturdy Mustang named Copper, picked its way carefully through the rocky terrain, each hoofbeat raising small clouds of red dust that clung to everything like rust. The leather of his saddle creaked with each step, a rhythm as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. He'd been riding since before dawn, moving a small herd of cattle from the Garrett Ranch to the holding pens near Amarillo. It was honest work when he could get it, though the pay barely covered beans and ammunition. Most folks in these parts knew him as a man who kept to himself, drifting from job to job like tumbleweed across the plains. Some called him a loner. Others whispered darker things about the scar that ran from his left ear to his collarbone, visible when his bandana slipped. Dusty didn't much care what they said. Words were just wind out here, and wind couldn't hurt a man who'd already been carved hollow. His cabin, if you could call 4 walls of weathered pine and a leaking roof a cabin, sat in the shadow of Cathedral Rock, a towering formation of red sandstone that caught the last light of every sunset. It wasn't much, but it was far enough from Red Bluff that the sheriff's men rarely bothered to ride out, and close enough to water that he wouldn't die of thirst. A man couldn't ask for more than that in this unforgiving country. The sun was beginning its slow descent when Dusty turned Copper toward home. They followed Willow Creek, though calling it a creek was generous. Most of the year it was nothing but a snake of cracked mud bordered by dying cottonwoods. But the spring rains had been better than usual, and a thin trickle of water still wound its way through the stones. That's when he saw her. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe heat exhaustion finally catching up to him. A splash of blue fabric against the brown earth, too bright to be natural. But as Copper picked his way closer, Dusty's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 at his hip. A woman lay motionless on the creek bank, half in the shallow water, half on the sandy shore. Her dress, what was left of it, had once been fine silk, the kind of thing you'd see in Harper's catalog, not out here in the middle of nowhere. Now it was torn from bodice to hem, the delicate fabric shredded as if she'd run through a field of thorns, or fought like a wildcat against someone stronger. Dusty dismounted slowly, his spurs jangling in the sudden quiet. Even the cicadas had stopped their endless drone. He approached cautiously, noting the way her chestnut hair had come loose from what must have been an elaborate arrangement of pins and ribbons. Her left sleeve was completely gone, revealing skin that had been pampered and protected from the sun, skin that belonged in a parlor, not face down in the dirt of Willow Creek. He knelt beside her and gently turned her over. She was breathing, shallow but steady. A purple bruise was already forming on her right cheekbone, and her wrists showed the angry red marks of rope burns, or maybe from strong hands that had held too tight. Blood had dried at the corner of her mouth, and her lips were cracked from the sun. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things often were, refined, delicate, clearly crafted for a life of comfort, the kind of woman who'd never spoken to him except to give orders for her husband's horses, the kind who crossed the street when she saw him coming, clutching her purse a little tighter. But out here, none of that mattered. Out here, she was just another soul the desert was trying to claim. Dusty gathered her up, surprised at how light she felt in his arms, like a bird with hollow bones. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he caught a whiff of lavender perfume mixed with sweat and fear. He managed to get her draped across Copper's saddle, then swung up behind her, holding her steady as they made the slow journey back to his cabin. The inside of his dwelling was sparse, a rope bed with a straw mattress, a pot-bellied stove, a rough table with one chair, and shelves holding his few possessions. He laid her on the bed and fetched water from the rain barrel outside, using his cleanest bandana, He gently cleaned the blood from her face and dripped water between her cracked lips. As the sun set, painting cathedral rock the color of fresh blood, the woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, green as bottle glass, wide with terror. She tried to sit up, gasped in pain, and fell back. "Easy," Dusty said, his voice rusty from disuse. "You're safe." Those green eyes focused on him, taking in his weathered face, the gun still at his hip, the rough walls of the cabin. He saw the moment she realized where she was, what he was. The fear in her eyes shifted, became something more complex, calculation mixed with desperation. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked as old leather. "Don't take me back." Dusty frowned. "Back where?" She turned her face to the wall. "I can't. Just please, I'll pay you. Whatever you want." "I don't want your money," he said, uncomfortable with the desperation in her voice. "What's your name?" Silence stretched between them. Finally, she spoke to the wall. "Mary. Just Mary." It was a lie, plain as day. Everything about her screamed money and position, from her soft hands to the way she held herself even while injured. But Dusty had told his own share of lies. A person's name was their own business. "All right, Mary," he said. "You hungry?" She nodded slightly. He heated up some beans and salt pork, the same meal he'd eaten for the past 3 days. She ate slowly, mechanically, as if remembering how to perform the simple act. When she finished, she looked at him directly for the first time. "That man who found me," she said carefully. "He's not coming back, is he?" "What man?" Dusty set down his own plate. "I found you by the creek. Nobody else around for miles." Her shoulders sagged with relief. "Then perhaps I might impose on your hospitality for a few days? Until I'm recovered?" Every instinct Dusty had developed over years of survival screamed at him to say no. A woman like this meant trouble. She had a story. And stories in these parts usually ended with someone dancing at the end of a rope. But something in those green eyes, not just fear, but a bone-deep exhaustion he recognized, made him nod. "You can stay until you're healed," he said. "But I've got work to do. I can't be playing nursemaid." "I don't need a nursemaid," she said, chin lifting with a ghost of pride. "Just time." As if to prove her point, she tried to stand. Her legs buckled immediately, and Dusty caught her before she hit the floor. For a moment, they were close enough that he could see the faint freckles across her nose, could feel her trembling like a snared rabbit. "Time it is, then," he said, helping her back to the bed. That night, Dusty spread his bedroll on the floor near the stove. He lay awake, listening to her breathing, sometimes steady, sometimes catching on what sounded like suppressed sobs. The moon rose full and bright, casting silver light through the gaps in the walls. In that light, he could see her clearly, curled on her side, arms wrapped around herself as if holding all her pieces together. He'd lived alone for 5 years, ever since the trouble in Abilene. He'd grown used to the silence, the simplicity of a life without complications. Now this woman, this Mary who wasn't Mary, had brought the outside world crashing into his refuge. He could smell trouble on her like smoke before a prairie fire. Come morning, he told himself, he'd take her to the dock in Red Bluff, let her become someone else's problem. He had cattle to move, fences to fix, a life to maintain that didn't include mysterious women with rope burns on their wrists. But when morning came, she was burning with fever. Her skin was hot as a branding iron, and she thrashed in delirium, calling out names he didn't recognize. "No, Reed, please," she begged the empty air. "I won't tell. I promise I won't tell." Dusty bathed her forehead with cool water, forced willow bark tea between her lips. The fever raged for 2 days. On the second night, it broke like a summer storm, leaving her drenched and shaking but lucid. She looked up at him with those green eyes, no longer glassy with fever. "You stayed," she said, as if this simple act of human decency was beyond her comprehension. "Said you could have a few days," he replied gruffly, turning away from the gratitude in her gaze. "Fever don't change that." But they both knew something had changed. In those 2 days, she'd trusted him with her vulnerability, and he'd answered with care. It was a dangerous precedent in a land where trust could get you killed faster than a rattlesnake bite. Outside, a coyote howled at the fading stars. Soon the sun would rise again, painting the desert in shades of gold and suffering. But for now, in the pre-dawn darkness of a cabin that smelled of sickness and mesquite smoke, 2 damaged souls shared an uneasy peace. Dusty didn't know her real name, didn't know why she'd been left for dead by Willow Creek, didn't know what kind of trouble would come looking for her. But as he watched her drift back to sleep, her face finally peaceful, he knew with the certainty of a man who'd lived by his instincts that his simple, solitary life was about to become anything but. The desert had brought her to him like a gift wrapped in thorns. Now he'd have to decide whether to grasp it tight or let it go before it drew blood. Either way, he suspected there'd be scars. The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Dusty would rise before dawn, tend to Copper and his small remuda of horses, then return to find Mary, as she insisted on being called, already awake, sitting at his rough table with her hands folded in her lap, like a schoolgirl awaiting instruction. On the 3rd morning, she surprised him. The smell of coffee hit him as soon as he opened the door. Real coffee, not the bitter chicory brew he'd grown accustomed to. She'd found his meager stash of beans, ground them between 2 rocks, and managed to coax a decent pot from his battered percolator. "I hope you don't mind," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "I wanted to contribute something." He grunted his approval and sat down to the best cup of coffee he'd had in months. She'd also attempted biscuits, though they were flat as coins and hard enough to drive nails. Still, the effort meant something. Women like her didn't cook. They had people for that. "Where'd you learn to make coffee?" he asked. A shadow crossed her face. "My father, before he passed, he said a proper cup of coffee could civilize any morning, no matter how savage." After breakfast, she stood and began clearing the table with movements that were awkward but determined. When she reached for his empty plate, the torn sleeve of her ruined dress caught on a splinter, tearing further. She stared at the exposed skin of her arm, as if seeing it for the first time. "I can't keep wearing this," she said quietly. Dusty rummaged through his trunk and produced a shirt and pair of trousers that had belonged to a smaller man, payment from a job gone wrong, the previous owner no longer having need of earthly garments. "They'll be too big, but they're clean." She took them with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you." While she changed behind the blanket he'd strung up for privacy, Dusty busied himself oiling his saddle, trying not to think about the sounds of silk tearing as she removed what was left of her fine dress. When she emerged, swimming in the oversized clothes, she looked younger, more vulnerable, also more determined. "I can work," she announced. "I won't be a burden." He wanted to tell her she already was, that every minute she stayed increased the chances of whatever trouble she was running from finding his door. Instead, he heard himself say, "Floor needs sweeping." And so she swept, raising clouds of dust that made them both cough. She attacked the job with a ferocity that spoke of desperation to prove her worth. When she finished the floor, she moved on to the dishes, scrubbing his 2 plates and 3 cups until they gleamed. As the days passed, she threw herself into the work of maintaining his simple household. She mended his shirts with tiny, perfect stitches. She organized his shelves, tisking at the disarray. She even attempted to patch the roof, though he had to rescue her when she got stuck halfway up, frozen with fear at the height. But it was the nights that revealed her true state. The first time gunfire echoed across the desert, just someone hunting coyotes miles away. She dropped to the floor like a soldier under fire, arms over her head, whole body shaking. Dusty found her there, curled in on herself, tears streaming down her face. "It's all right," he said awkwardly, not knowing whether to touch her or keep his distance. "Just hunters," she laughed, a broken sound. "Of course, hunters." But she stayed on the floor for another minute, gathering the pieces of herself back together. The second time was worse. Thunder rolled across the plains like artillery, and she came apart entirely. He woke to find her pressed into the corner, knees drawn to her chest, mumbling fragments of prayer mixed with pleas. "Please, read. I didn't see anything. I don't know anything. Please." This time he did touch her, just a hand on her shoulder. She flinched so hard she hit her head on the wall, then seemed to see him clearly. Without a word, she launched herself at him, arms wrapping around his chest like he was a mast in a storm. He held her awkwardly at first, unused to providing comfort, but as her sobs soaked through his shirt, something in him softened. He stroked her hair, matted with sweat, and made the kind of nonsense sounds he used to calm spooked horses. Gradually, her breathing slowed to match his. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his chest. "I'm not usually so scared." He felt her nod. "Nothing wrong with being scared. Fear keeps you alive out here." She pulled back to look at him, her face inches from his in the lightning-lit darkness. "What are you afraid of?" The question hung between them like a loaded gun. He thought of Abilene, of blood on saloon floors and the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. "Getting attached to things I can't keep," he said finally. Something shifted in her expression. She returned to her side of the room without another word. But the air between them had changed, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. As the first week became 2, she began to reveal herself in fragments. Not the big things, not her real name or why she'd been left for dead, but smaller truths. She hummed while she worked. Melodies he recognized from church services he'd attended a lifetime ago. She knew the names of all the birds, could identify them by their songs. She read every book on his meager shelf, even his grandfather's Bible with its cramped marginalia, handling each one like a treasure. "You're educated," he observed one evening as she read by lamplight. "My mother insisted," she said carefully. "She said a woman should cultivate her mind, even if society preferred her to hide it. Smart woman. She was—" The past tense hung heavy. "She died when I was 15. Father remarried within the year. My stepmother had different ideas about a woman's place." One afternoon, while he was reshaping horseshoes at his makeshift forge, she appeared at his elbow. "Show me." "Show you what?" "How to do that. How to make something useful from raw metal." He looked at her soft hands, already blistered from housework. "It's not women's work." Her chin lifted in that way he'd come to recognize. "Neither is surviving alone in the desert. Yet here I am." So he taught her, guiding her hands on the hammer, showing her how to read the color of heated metal. She was a quick study, fearless of the sparks, determined to master each step. When she successfully shaped her first horseshoe nail, she held it up like a trophy, grinning with a joy that transformed her face. That was the moment Dusty knew he was in real trouble. Not the kind that came with guns and badges, but the kind that burrowed under a man's skin and made a home in his bones. They were sharing supper, venison stew she'd somehow made palatable with wild herbs, when she finally offered him a piece of truth. "I was married," she said to her bowl. "Am married, I suppose, though I doubt he sees it that way anymore." Dusty kept eating, knowing that words were like wild horses, pushed too hard and they'd bolt. He seemed so charming at first, successful, respected, everything a girl from a good family should want. Her laugh was bitter as old coffee. "My father had debts. Reed, my husband, offered to help. It seemed like Providence. Reed." Dusty tested the name. "Don't know any Reeds in these parts." She looked up sharply, then seemed to remember her pretense. "It's a common name." "Sure it is." They ate in silence for a while. Then, as if a dam had cracked, she continued. "The charm lasted exactly until our wedding night. After that, I learned what kind of man I'd bound myself to. He had rules, so many rules. How I should dress, speak, move. Who I could see, what I could know." Her hand went unconsciously to her throat, and Dusty noticed for the first time the faint marks there, older than her recent injuries. Finger marks. "Some men think a wife is property," he said quietly, "like a horse or a piece of land." "Yes, The word came out raw. And when property doesn't behave, it needs correction. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Dusty's hands tightened on his spoon. He'd known men like that, had seen what they did to anything weaker than themselves. The thought of someone putting hands on her in anger made something primitive rise in his chest. Is he looking for you? Undoubtedly. He doesn't like losing things that belong to him. You don't belong to anyone, Dusty said, the words coming out harsher than intended. She looked at him with those green eyes that had seen too much. The law says different. The church says different. Everyone says different except you. That night, as they settled into their respective spaces, she spoke from the darkness. Why haven't you asked me for the truth? My real name, where I'm from. Dusty stared at the ceiling, considering. Figure when you're ready, you'll tell me. Until then, your secrets are your own. Most men would demand answers. I'm not most men. No, she said softly. You're not. The storm came 3 nights later. Not the gentle rains that occasionally blessed the desert, but a full-throated tempest that shook the cabin walls and sent water streaming through every gap in the roof. Lightning turned night into stuttering day, and thunder followed so close it felt like the world was ending. Dusty was trying to position pots under the worst leaks when he heard her cry out. She was pressed against the wall, eyes wide and unseeing. Lost in some memory the storm had dragged to the surface. Without thinking, he crossed to her, pulling her against him. You're safe, he said, over and over, a litany against the storm. I've got you, you're safe. She clung to him like he was the only solid thing in a world gone liquid. Between thunderclaps, she spoke in broken sentences. The night I ran, storm like this, he was drunk, said he'd kill me if I didn't sign the papers. What papers? The mineral rights, the land deeds. He's been stealing from the town, from the farmers. I found the documents. He beat me until I couldn't stand, but I wouldn't sign. Each word was a puzzle piece, forming a picture Dusty didn't want to see but couldn't look away from. A powerful man, corruption, a woman who knew too much. It was an old story in these parts, as common as drought and just as deadly. So, you ran. Barely. He thought he'd killed me. Left me by the creek to make it look like an accident. But I woke up, crawled away, then nothing until I saw your face. The storm was passing, thunder growing distant, but neither of them moved. They stood there in the center of his humble cabin, holding each other like survivors of a shipwreck. Her body fit against his in a way that felt both foreign and inevitable. He became aware of her warmth, the way her breath stirred the hair at the base of his throat. The fact that beneath his borrowed clothes, she was soft and curved and utterly feminine. She must have felt the shift too, because she pulled back slightly, looking up at him. In the lamplight, her eyes were deep as wells. Dusty, she said, and it was question and answer and plea all at once. He should have stepped away, should have remembered all the reasons this was a bad idea. Instead, he touched her face, thumb brushing the bruise that had faded to yellow-green. She leaned into his touch like a cat seeking warmth. I'm no good for you, he said. I'm a man with no future, no family, no... She silenced him by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. It was a hesitant kiss, almost chaste, but it set fire to something that had been dormant in him for years. When she pulled back, they were both breathing hard. I don't care about any of that, she said. You're the first person in years to see me as human instead of property. Do you know what that means to me? He did know, because she'd done the same for him. In her eyes, he wasn't the drifter, the man with blood on his hands, the self-imposed exile. He was just Dusty, who made sure she had enough to eat and held her through storms. But reality hadn't changed. Somewhere out there, a man with power and violence at his disposal was looking for her. And when he found her, men like that always found what they were looking for. Dusty would have to decide whether to fight or let her go. We can't, he said, though every part of him screamed otherwise. Not while you're still married. Not while he's out there. She nodded. understanding and disappointment warring on her face. "You're right. Of course you're right." They separated, returning to their respective sides of the room. But something fundamental had shifted. The careful distance they'd maintained was gone, replaced by an awareness that made every accidental touch electric. Every shared glance weighted with possibility. As Mary, or whatever her real name was, settled onto her palate, she spoke one last time. "When this is over, when I'm free, would you still want someone like me, knowing what you know?" Dusty thought of all the reasons to say no, the danger, the complications, the fact that she came from a world he'd never fit into. But what came out was, "I'd want you if you came with nothing but the clothes on your back and a dozen angry husbands on your trail." Her laugh was soft and sad. "Don't tempt fate, Mr. McKenna. One angry husband is more than enough." As sleep finally took them, the last of the storm moved on, leaving the desert washed clean and gleaming under stars. But inside the cabin, 2 people lay awake in the dark, each wrestling with feelings they couldn't afford to have and futures they didn't dare imagine. The morning would bring new challenges, new dangers creeping closer with each passing hour. But for now, in the quiet aftermath of storms both literal and emotional, they had this, the knowledge that they were no longer alone, and the terrible, wonderful certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. The decision to leave came with the dawn. Dusty had spent the night listening to the desert sounds, coyotes, wind, the skitter of small creatures, but underneath it all, he heard something else, a wrongness in the rhythm. Horses had passed too close in the night, moving too purposefully to be wild mustangs. "We need to move," he told Mary over their morning coffee. She'd taken to adding a pinch of cinnamon she'd found in his stores, making even their simple breakfast feel like something more. Her hand stilled on her cup. "They're getting closer." It wasn't a question. She'd felt it too, that tightening noose of inevitability. "There's a place," Dusty said, "up in the canyon country, hidden, secure. We can hole up there until I figure out our next move." "Our?" She looked at him with those green eyes that had become too dear too quickly. "You think I'd send you off alone?" He busied himself packing supplies, not wanting to see what his admission might spark in her face. "Get your things. We leave within the hour." They rode double on Copper, Mary sitting in front of him, his arms around her to hold the reins. It was tortuous and necessary. Her body pressed against his for miles of rough trail. She'd plaited her hair in a simple braid and wore his extra hat pulled low. From a distance, they might pass for a single rider. The journey took them higher into the mountains, following trails Dusty had learned from an old Apache scout years back. The paths were treacherous, barely wide enough for a horse, with drops that would make a mountain goat nervous. But Mary never complained, never showed fear, though he felt her tense when loose rocks scattered down the cliff sides. By afternoon, they reached the hidden canyon. It was a slash in the earth, invisible until you were nearly on top of it, protected by overhanging rock and centuries of erosion. A spring bubbled from the rock face, feeding a small pool before disappearing underground. Ancient petroglyphs marked the walls, symbols of water, shelter, sanctuary. "It's beautiful," Mary breathed, sliding down from Copper with obvious relief. Dusty dismounted and began unloading their supplies. Used to be a sacred place for the local tribes. They say lovers would come here to marry in secret, away from disapproving families. She traced one of the symbols with her finger. Star-crossed lovers hiding from the world. Seems appropriate. They set up a simple camp under the overhang. Dusty had cached supplies here months ago. Blankets, dried food, ammunition. Old habit from his days running from the law. He'd never thought he'd use it to protect someone else. As the sun set, painting the canyon walls in shades of rust and gold, Mary finally told him everything. "My name is Margaret," she began, staring into their small fire. "Margaret Elizabeth Thornberry. Before I married, my husband is Reed Matheson, mayor of Red Bluff." Dusty kept his face neutral, but inside, his gut tightened. He'd heard of Matheson. Everyone in 3 counties had. the man who'd brought prosperity to Red Bluff, who turned a dying cattle town into a hub of commerce, the man whose word was law. I was 17 when my father introduced us. Margaret continued. Father owned the second largest ranch in the county, but drought and bad investments had left him desperate. Reed offered a partnership, a way to save the land. The price was me. She poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. I thought I was being noble, saving my family. Reed was handsome, charming, 20 years older, but that seemed sophisticated. Everyone said I was lucky. The beating started a month after our wedding. Small things at first, a slap for speaking out of turn, a shove for embarrassing him. He always apologized after, brought gifts, said it was his passion for me that made him lose control. Dusty's hands clenched. He'd seen this dance before, the cycle of violence and contrition that kept women trapped. But it wasn't passion, Margaret said. It was control. He needed to own everything around him, people, land, commerce. And when the railroad company started buying up land for their new route, he saw an opportunity. She looked at Dusty directly now, firelight dancing in her eyes. He's been forging deeds, intimidating farmers into selling for pennies on the dollar, then reselling to the railroad at enormous profit. Those who won't sell, accidents happen, fires, poisoned wells. The sheriff is his man, bought and paid for. And you found proof. She nodded. In his study. Documents, correspondence, records of bribes. I was looking for laudanum. He'd hurt my ribs. I couldn't sleep. Instead, I found evidence that could hang him. So, he tried to kill you. Not at first. First, he tried to make me complicit. Wanted me to sign papers making me co-owner of the stolen properties. Said if I loved him, I'd support him. When I refused, she touched her throat unconsciously. He was drunk, angrier than I'd ever seen him. Said if I wouldn't be his partner, I'd be his example, that they'd find me dead and everyone would know what happened to wives who didn't obey. But you survived. Barely. I played dead when he finally stopped. He and his man Carson dragged me to Willow Creek, talked about making it look like I'd fallen from my horse. But they were drunk, sloppy, left before making sure. I crawled into the brush, hid until morning. Then you found me. They sat in silence, the weight of her story settling between them. Dusty added wood to the fire, processing what she'd told him. Reed Matheson wasn't just a violent husband. He was a man with an empire built on blood, with resources and reach that made him nearly untouchable. You need to get to the federal marshals, Dusty said finally. Or the railroad investigators, someone outside Matheson's influence. With what proof? The documents are in his safe. My word against his means nothing. A hysterical wife making wild accusations. Her laugh was bitter. He's thought of everything? Then we run. Get you somewhere safe. San Francisco. Maybe, or... No. The word came out sharp as a slap. I'm tired of running. Tired of being afraid. Those farmers, those families he's destroying. Someone needs to stop him. That someone doesn't have to be you. She stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the firelight. Then who? You? You'll risk your life for strangers. I'm already risking it for you. The words hung in the air. Margaret turned back to him, something raw and desperate in her face. Why? Why are you doing this? Dusty stood too, closing the distance between them. You know why. Say it. Her voice was barely a whisper. I need to hear you say it. He reached out, cupping her face in his calloused hands. Because somewhere between you stealing my coffee and teaching you to shoe horses, I fell in love with you. God help me, but I did. She made a sound between a laugh and a sob. You fool! You beautiful, stubborn fool! Don't you know I'll get you killed? Maybe, but I'll die knowing I finally found something worth dying for. She kissed him then, fierce and desperate, like she was trying to pour all her fear and longing and gratitude into this one moment. He responded in kind, pulling her against him, feeling the way her body molded to his like they'd been carved from the same stone. When they broke apart, both breathing hard. She rested her forehead against his, I love you too. I shouldn't. It's selfish and dangerous, but I do. They stood there in the firelight, holding each other, while the ancient canyon walls stood witness. After a time, they settled by the fire. Margaret curled against Dusty's side, his arm around her shoulders. Tell me about before, she said. You mentioned Abilene. Dusty was quiet for a long moment. I was a different man then. Younger. Thought I was faster with a gun than anyone had a right to be. Worked as a hired gun for whoever paid best. What changed? I killed a boy. The words came out flat. Matter of fact. 16 years old, trying to prove himself. Called me out in a saloon. I could have walked away, could have wounded him, could have done a dozen things different, but I was proud, angry. I shot him dead in front of his father. Margaret didn't pull away, just tightened her hold on his hand. His father didn't cry, didn't rage, just looked at me and said, I hope someday you love someone the way I loved my son, and I hope you lose them the same way. Then he walked out, left me standing there with his boy's blood on my boots. That's when you came here. Couldn't stomach the life anymore. Figured if I stayed away from people, I couldn't hurt anyone else. Built that cabin, kept my head down, tried to forget the weight of a gun in my hand. But you still wear it. Old habits. And out here, a man without a gun is just a corpse waiting to happen. Margaret was quiet, then spoke softly. That boy's father was wrong. You're not the same man who pulled that trigger. How do you know? Because that man wouldn't have saved a stranger by a creek. Wouldn't have nursed her through fever or taught her to work metal or held her through storms. She looked up at him. You're not running from who you were, Dusty. You're becoming who you're meant to be. They made love that night under the stars, on blankets spread over ancient stone. It was different from their desperate kiss in the cabin, slower, deeper, a claiming and a promise. Dusty mapped every inch of her with hands and mouth, memorizing her like a prayer. She responded with equal fervor, her soft cries echoing off the canyon walls. Afterward, they lay entwined, her head on his chest, his fingers combing through her unbound hair. What are we going to do? She asked. First, we survive. Then we figure out how to get you free. And then, he pressed a kiss to her forehead. Then I make an honest woman of you, if you'll have me. She laughed softly. A mayor's wife running off with a gunslinger. What would people say? Let them talk. Out here, we make our own rules. They slept fitfully, waking often to check the canyon entrance, to listen for sounds of pursuit. But the night passed peacefully, just the whisper of wind through stone and the distant call of an owl. Morning brought clarity and cold purpose. They couldn't stay hidden forever. Matheson had resources, men who knew how to track. Eventually, he'd find them. We need those documents, Margaret said over breakfast. Without them, he wins. Breaking into the mayor's house is suicide. Not breaking in, I still have a key. She pulled a brass key from her bodice, where she'd kept it hidden all this time. To the back entrance, the servants' stairs. Dusty stared at her. You've been planning this. Hoping for it. If I could get back, get to his study while he's at the town council meeting. She trailed off at his expression. Absolutely not. Dusty, no. I won't let you walk back into that monster's house. Her chin lifted in that stubborn way he'd come to both love and dread. Let me. I don't recall asking permission. They argued as the sun climbed higher, voices echoing off the canyon walls. But in the end, Dusty knew she was right. Without proof, they'd be running forever. With it, they might have a chance at real freedom. Fine, he said finally. But we do this my way. Together. Relief flooded her face. Together. They spent the rest of the day planning, going over every detail of the house, the servants' schedules, Matheson's routines. As the sun set on their second night in the canyon, they prepared to leave their sanctuary and walk straight into the lion's den. You know this is probably going to get us both killed, Dusty said as they packed their few belongings. Margaret smiled, a real smile that transformed her face. Maybe, but at least we'll go down fighting. Together. He pulled her close, kissing her hard. Together, he agreed. As they rode out of the canyon, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, Dusty felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. It was dangerous, probably foolish, certainly going to complicate everything. But like the woman pressed against him as they descended into uncertainty, it was worth the risk. Behind them, the canyon kept its secrets. Ahead lay Red Bluff, Reed Matheson, and a reckoning 5 years in the making. But for now, for this moment, they had each other, in a land where that was often all that stood between a man and madness. It was enough. The desert swallowed them up, two souls bound by love and desperation, riding toward a dawn that would bring either freedom or destruction. Only time would tell which. The ride to Red Bluff took most of the night. They skirted the main roads, keeping to cattle paths and dry washes where their passage would leave no trace. The moon was a silver coin overhead, providing just enough light to navigate by. Neither spoke much, each lost in thoughts of what lay ahead. Dusty left Margaret hidden in an abandoned line shack on the outskirts of town just before dawn. "I'll be back before noon," he promised, checking his Colt one more time. "If I'm not, you will be." She gripped his hand tight. "Just find out what you can and come back to me." Red Bluff was already stirring as Dusty rode in. Merchants sweeping their storefronts, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. It all seemed so normal, so peaceful. Hard to believe corruption festered beneath the surface like a hidden rot. He tied Copper outside Morrison's general store and went in, pulling his hat low. The proprietor, a thin man with nervous hands, looked up from his ledger. "Help you? Need supplies, coffee, beans, ammunition?" Dusty kept his voice casual. "Been out on the range a spell." "Anything interesting happen while I was gone?" Morrison's hand stilled. He glanced toward the door, then leaned closer. "Mayor's wife went missing 2 weeks back. Terrible thing. They say she fell from her horse, got swept away by the creek. Never found the body." "That's so?" "Mayor's been torn up about it, offering $1,000 to anyone who finds her remains. Says he wants to give her a proper Christian burial." Morrison's voice dropped further. "Though between you and me, some folks wonder. She had bruises, tried to hide them, but we all saw." Dusty made sympathetic noises while filing away the information. $1,000 was serious money. Every bounty hunter and desperate drifter in 3 states would be looking. "Course, that's not the only strange thing," Morrison continued, warming to his gossip. "Sheriff's been bringing in extra deputies. Hard cases from Amarillo. Say it's to keep order during the railroad negotiations, but..." But the Henderson farm burned last week. The widow Martinez's well went bad. Folks who won't sell are having powerful bad luck." Dusty purchased his supplies and left, mind churning. He made a few more stops, the saloon, the barber, the livery, gathering fragments of information. The picture that emerged was clear. Matheson was accelerating his plans, using his wife's death as cover while he consolidated power. At the saloon, nursing a whiskey he didn't want. Dusty overheard 2 of the new deputies talking. "Boss wants us to check every shack and cabin within 20 miles. One said, 'Someone help that woman, and he aims to find out who.' Waste of time if you ask me." The other replied, "Creek got her. Plain and simple." "You didn't see his face when Carson came back without the body. Never seen a man that angry. Nah, she's alive somewhere. And when we find her..." He drew a finger across his throat. Dusty finished his drink and left, stomach churning. Time was running out faster than they'd thought. He was heading back to Copper when a familiar voice stopped him cold. Well, Dusty McKenna." Turning slowly, Dusty found himself facing Jake Carson, Matheson's right hand. The man was built like a bull, with scarred knuckles and dead eyes. They'd crossed paths before, neither encounter pleasant. "Carson." Dusty kept his hand casual, but ready. "Heard you were working for the mayor now. Pays better than cattle work. Carson's smile was all teeth. "What brings you to town? Thought you preferred your own company out at that rat's nest you call a cabin. Supplies. A man's got to eat." Sure. Carson stepped closer, and Dusty could smell the whiskey on him despite the early hour. "Funny thing, though, we checked your place yesterday. Looked like you'd left in a hurry. Looked like maybe you'd had company." Dusty shrugged. "Must have been while I was out hunting. Apache, maybe. Looking for water." "Apache." Carson's eyes narrowed. "Or maybe a woman who should have stayed dead." The threat hung between them. Dusty met his gaze steadily. "Don't know anything about any woman." "No, because the mayor, he's real interested in talking to anyone who might have seen his poor, dear wife before her tragic accident. Real generous, too. $1,000 generous." "Like I said, I don't know anything." Carson studied him for a long moment. Then he stepped back. "You hear anything, you let us know. Mayor's a good friend to have. Bad enemy, though, real bad." Dusty touched his hat brim. "I'll keep that in mind." He rode out of town at an easy pace, every nerve screaming to gallop but knowing Carson was watching. Only when Red Bluff disappeared behind a rise did he wheel Copper around and race back to Margaret. She was pacing the shack when he arrived, nearly throwing herself at him in relief. "I heard horses earlier. I thought—" "We've got problems." He told her what he'd learned, watched her face pale. "They're closing in. We need to move tonight or not at all." Margaret sank onto a crate, processing. Then she looked up, jaw set. "Tonight, then. The town council meets at 7. Reed never misses it, too important for his image. That gives us maybe 2 hours at the house. It's not enough time. Too risky. Everything's risky now." She stood, began checking the loads in the derringer she'd kept hidden. "But those documents are our only chance. Without them, we're just outlaws. With them, he's the criminal." They spent the afternoon preparing. Dusty cleaned and oiled his weapons while Margaret drew a detailed map of the house from memory. They went over the plan again and again, trying to anticipate every possible complication. As the sun began its descent, they set out. Margaret had changed back into what remained of her dress, now mended and cleaned as best they could manage. From a distance, in the gathering dusk, she might pass for a respectable woman. Up close, the repairs were obvious, but they were counting on speed, not scrutiny. They left Copper hidden in a stand of cottonwoods near the edge of town. The servants' entrance Margaret had mentioned was accessible through an alley that ran behind the mayor's mansion. They waited in the shadows, watching the house. At 10 minutes to 7, Reed Matheson emerged from the front door, even from their hiding spot. Dusty could see why the man commanded respect. Tall, distinguished, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most folks made in a year, he walked like he owned the world, which in Red Bluff, he essentially did. They waited another 15 minutes to be sure, then made their move. Margaret's key still worked, the door opening onto a narrow staircase. The house was quiet. Most of the servants dismissed for the evening. "His study is on the 2nd floor." Margaret whispered, "End of the hall." They climbed the stairs, Dusty with his gun drawn, every sense alert. The hallway was carpeted, muffling their steps. Paintings of stern-faced ancestors watched from the walls. Everything spoke of wealth and power built over generations. The study door was locked, but Margaret produced another key. Inside, the room was all dark wood and leather, dominated by a massive desk. Behind it, a portrait of Matheson looked down with cold eyes. "The safe is behind the portrait," Margaret said, already moving. She swung the painting aside to reveal an iron safe. "I don't know the combination." Dusty examined the lock. "I might be able to—" Footsteps in the hall cut him off. They froze, listening. The steps paused outside the door. "Sir?" A woman's voice. "Is someone there?" Margaret looked at Dusty, terror in her eyes. He pointed to a heavy curtain beside the window. They slipped behind it just as the door opened. A maid entered, lamp in hand. She looked around the study, frowning. Hello? For a heart-stopping moment, she moved toward their hiding spot. Then something else caught her attention, the portrait, slightly askew. She reached up to straighten it. Martha? The maid spun around with a gasp. Carson stood in the doorway, filling it with his bulk. Mr. Carson, you scared me. I thought I heard... Mayor asked me to fetch some papers. He moved into the room, eyes scanning. You can go. Yes, sir. She scurried out. Carson didn't move, just stood there, head tilted like a hunting dog. Dusty's hand tightened on his gun. Beside him, Margaret had stopped breathing. Finally, Carson moved to the desk, rifled through some papers, and left. They waited another 5 minutes before emerging. We need to hurry, Dusty said. Margaret was already at the safe, fingers trembling as she spun the dial. I watched him once. I think I remember. Click, click, click. The tumblers fell into place. The safe swung open. Inside were stacks of documents, cash and a small revolver. Margaret grabbed the papers, scanning quickly. These are them deeds, contracts, correspondence about the railroad. It's all here. Then let's go. She stuffed the documents into a leather satchel from the desk. They were almost to the door when they heard it. Voices in the hall. Getting closer. Told you I forgot something. Won't take but a minute. Matheson. The meeting must have been postponed. There was no time to reach the curtain. Dusty pulled Margaret behind the desk just as the door opened. Matheson entered with another man, both in conversation. The Henderson property is the key, Matheson was saying. Once we have that, we control the whole water road. The railroad will have to pay whatever we ask. And if Henderson won't sell, then he'll have an accident, like his neighbor did. They moved to the safe. Matheson's back was to the desk, but his companion faced it. Any movement would be seen. That's odd, Matheson said. I could have sworn I locked this. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Matheson spun the dial, pulled the handle. The safe swung open, revealing the empty space where the documents had been. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Matheson's voice, deadly quiet. Carson? The other man backed toward the door. Reed, what? Get Carson. Lock down the house. Someone's been here. The man fled. Matheson stood perfectly still, and in that stillness, Dusty saw death coming. The mayor reached for the desk drawer where men like him always kept a gun. Don't, Dusty said, standing and leveling his Colt. Matheson froze, his eyes taking in Dusty, then widening as Margaret rose beside him. Hello, Reed, she said quietly. The mayor's face went through a series of transformations, shock, rage, and finally, a terrible calm. Margaret, my dear wife, I've been so worried. I'm sure you have. Those documents belong to me. They belong to the people you stole from. Margaret's voice was steady, but Dusty could see her hands shaking. And now they're going to the federal marshals. Matheson laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You think you'll make it out of this house? Carson has 20 men. You're already dead. Maybe, Dusty said. But so are you if you move. They could hear footsteps, shouts, the sound of men mobilizing. Time was running out. You, Matheson said to Dusty. You're the one who took her. Do you know what she is? A lying, vicious woman who'd sell her own husband for... Margaret's derringer appeared in her hand. The shot was impossibly loud in the enclosed space. Matheson screamed, clutching his thigh as blood seeped through his fingers. That's for every bruise, she said. Every broken rib, every night I prayed for death rather than face you again. The door burst open. Carson appeared, gun drawn. Dusty fired, the bullet catching the big man in the shoulder, spinning him back into the hall. More men were coming. The window, Dusty said. He shot out the glass, grabbed Margaret's hand. They jumped together, landing hard in the rose bushes below. Thorns tore at them, but they were up and running as shouts erupted from the house. They ran through the dark streets, the satchel of documents clutched in Margaret's arms. Behind them, they could hear pursuit organizing. They'd never make it to Copper, never make it out of town on foot. This way, Margaret gasped, pulling him toward the church. The building was dark, empty. They slipped inside, pressed against the door as men ran past outside. In the silence, they could hear each other's ragged breathing. "Are you hurt?" Dusty asked. "No, you." "No." He laughed, short and bitter. "But we're trapped. They'll search every building. Maybe not this one." She moved deeper into the church, to the altar. "Reed owns everyone in this town, but not Father Miguel. He came after Reed did. Never took his money." As if summoned, a door opened beside the altar. An elderly Mexican priest emerged, carrying a candle. He took in their torn clothes, the gun still in Dusty's hand. Margaret's face. "Senora Matheson," he said calmly. "I wondered when you would come. Father, we need sanctuary." "Yes." He moved with surprising speed for his age, leading them to a small room behind the vestry. "You can hide here. They will not violate the church." "They might," Dusty said. "These aren't God-fearing men." Father Miguel smiled. "No, but they are superstitious, and I have buried too many of their secrets to risk making an enemy of me." He looked at Margaret with compassion. "I have prayed for you, child. Prayed someone would help you escape that monster." "We have proof of his crimes," Margaret said, showing the satchel. "But we need to get it to the authorities." "The stage to Austin leaves at dawn. I can hide you until then. Get you on board. From there, we disappear." Dusty finished. They spent the night in that small room, listening to the search rage through the town. Several times, men came to the church doors, but Father Miguel turned them away with quiet authority. Matheson might own the town, but even he wasn't ready to drag a priest from his church. As the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, Father Miguel returned with traveling clothes and news. "Matheson lives, more's the pity, but he is wounded in more than body. The town talks of nothing but what was found in his safe. Some of the ranchers are already organizing, demanding investigations." He led them out through a hidden door to where a covered wagon waited. "Lie beneath the blankets. I will drive you to the stage." The journey to the stage depot was the longest of Dusty's life. Every voice made him tense. Every stop of the wagon felt like disaster. But Father Miguel's presence was like a shield. No one questioned a priest on his morning rounds. At the depot, they climbed quickly aboard the stage. Only a few other passengers, all looking away as was the custom. As the driver prepared to leave, Dusty saw riders approaching fast. Carson, his arm in a sling, leading them. "Go," Father Miguel told the driver. "Now!" The whip cracked. The stage lurched forward. Carson shouted, raising his gun, but Father Miguel stepped between them and the stage, arms spread wide. Even Carson wouldn't shoot a priest in broad daylight. As Red Bluff fell away behind them, Margaret leaned against Dusty's shoulder. "We did it. We're not safe yet. He'll send men after us." "I know, but we have the proof, and we have each other." He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close as the stage carried them toward Austin and the federal marshals. Behind them, the sun rose over Red Bluff, painting the sky the color of blood and redemption. They'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. Matheson was wounded but not defeated. He had money, men, influence. They had a satchel of documents and a love forged in desperation. But sometimes, Dusty thought as Margaret dozed against his shoulder, that was enough. Sometimes love and justice were stronger than all the corruption money could buy. They'd find out soon enough if he was right. The stage rolled on, carrying them toward an uncertain future. But for the first time in years, Dusty felt something he'd thought lost forever. Hope, dangerous as it was, painful as it might prove. It burned in his chest like a flame that refused to die. Beside him, Margaret stirred, murmured his name. He pressed a kiss to her hair and watched the Texas landscape roll by. Every mile taking them further from Matheson's reach and closer to a reckoning that would shape the rest of their lives. The ambush came at Skeleton Pass, where the stage road narrowed between towering rocks. Dusty had been expecting it, had felt it in his bones the way old wounds ached before a storm. When the first rifle shot cracked through the morning air, he was already pushing Margaret to the floor. "Everyone down!" he shouted as bullets peppered the coach. The driver cursed, whipping the horses faster, but there was nowhere to run. Riders emerged from behind the rocks, bandanas covering their faces, guns blazing. The stage lurched to a halt as one of the horses screamed and went down. "Come out, McKenna!" Carson's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Send the woman out and you can ride away." Dusty checked his ammunition. 6 shots in the Colt, maybe a dozen in his rifle, against at least 8 men. Not good odds. "What do we do?" Margaret whispered. She'd drawn her derringer, though it would be like throwing pebbles at a tornado. "We don't give up," Dusty said. "Not when we've come this far." An elderly woman passenger was praying in Spanish. A drummer cowered behind his sample cases. The driver was already raising his hands, wanting no part of this fight. "You've got 10 seconds, Carson called. Dusty made a decision. "When I start shooting, you run behind those rocks to the east. Keep low. I'm not leaving you. You're protecting those documents. That's what matters." He gripped her hand. "Promise me you'll run." Before she could answer, he kicked open the stage door and came out firing. His first shot took a rider from his saddle. The second sent Carson diving for cover. Then the world exploded in gunfire. Dusty rolled behind the dead horse, using it as a shield. From the corner of his eye, he saw Margaret sprint from the coach, the satchel clutched to her chest. 2 riders wheeled toward her. Dusty dropped one, but the other was closing fast. Then something unexpected. The elderly woman passenger emerged from the coach with a shotgun that must have been hidden under her skirts. The blast knocked the rider backward off his horse. "Run, child!" she shouted at Margaret before ducking back inside. More shots. Dusty felt fire tear across his ribs. Blood soaked his shirt, but he kept firing. 4 men down, but more were coming. His rifle clicked empty. That's when he heard it. Hoofbeats from the north, a lot of them. Carson heard it too, head swiveling. Then someone shouted, "Marshals! Federal marshals! Drop your weapons!" The surviving ambushers scattered like quail, Carson among them. Within moments, the pass was filled with men wearing badges, led by a grim-faced officer with steel-gray hair. "Who's in charge here?" the marshal demanded. Margaret emerged from behind the rocks, dusty but unharmed. "I am Margaret Matheson. We have documents proving corruption and murder in Red Bluff. These men were trying to stop us from reaching Austin." The marshal's eyes narrowed. "The mayor's wife, we heard you were dead." "As you can see, that was premature." She moved to where Dusty was trying to stand, blood running down his side. "This man saved my life. He needs a doctor." The next hours blurred together. The marshals commandeered a wagon to transport the wounded. A field surgeon cleaned and bandaged Dusty's wound, painful but not deep. Margaret never left his side, holding his hand as the surgeon worked. They reached Austin by nightfall, where Margaret presented the documents to the federal prosecutor. The man's eyes widened as he read, occasionally whistling low. "This is extensive," he said finally. "Fraud, intimidation, conspiracy to commit murder. You realize what you're accusing one of Texas's most powerful men of?" "I'm not accusing," Margaret said steadily. "I'm providing proof. And you'll testify." "Yes." The prosecutor looked at Dusty. "You too?" "Whatever it takes." They were placed in protective custody, a boarding house with marshals stationed outside, for 3 days. Margaret gave depositions while Dusty healed. She detailed every crime she'd witnessed, every beating she'd endured, every family destroyed by her husband's greed. On the 4th day, word came that arrest warrants had been issued. Federal marshals were riding to Red Bluff. Reed Matheson's empire was crumbling. "It's over," Margaret said that night, collapsing beside Dusty on the small bed they shared. "It's really over." "Not yet," he warned. "Men like Matheson don't go down easy. He'll fight, maybe run." She was quiet for a long moment. "I shot him, my own husband. What kind of woman does that make me?" Dusty turned her face to his. "A survivor, a woman who refused to be destroyed. Don't you dare feel guilty for defending yourself." "I don't feel guilty," she admitted. "That's what scares me. I felt free. For the first time in years, I felt free." He kissed her gently, mindful of his healing ribs. "Freedom looks good on you." They made love carefully that night, aware of the marshals outside, of the uncertain future ahead. But in that small room, with clean sheets and lockable doors, they carved out a moment of peace. Margaret traced the new scar on his ribs, adding it to her mental map of his body. He unpinned her hair, letting it fall like copper silk across the pillows. "What happens when this is truly over?" she asked in the darkness. "We go somewhere new. California, maybe Oregon, somewhere Matheson's name means nothing. As husband and wife. If you'll have me, though we'll need to wait for your divorce." She was quiet so long he thought she'd fallen asleep. Then, "He'll never divorce me. It would mean admitting failure. He'd rather see me dead." Dusty pulled her closer. "Then we'll live in sin until the law catches up with morality." "Wouldn't be the worst thing I've done." The next morning brought chaos. A marshal burst in with news. Matheson had barricaded himself in his mansion with 20 hired guns. When the federal officers tried to serve the warrants, shots were fired. 2 marshals were wounded. The mayor had declared he'd never be taken alive. "Damn fool," the prosecutor muttered. "He's making it worse." "No," Margaret said quietly. "He's being exactly who he is, a man who'd rather destroy everything than lose control." The standoff lasted 2 days. The governor called in the Texas Rangers. Negotiations went nowhere. Matheson demanded safe passage to Mexico, a fortune in gold, and Margaret returned to him. That last demand he repeated over and over, ranting about ungrateful wives and the sanctity of marriage. On the evening of the second day, smoke was seen rising from the mansion. "He's burning the evidence," someone said. "No," Margaret whispered, her face pale. "He's burning it all." The fire spread quickly, too quickly to be anything but deliberately set. Men fled the mansion, some surrendering, others shooting their way out. But Reed Matheson never emerged. They found his body the next morning in the ruins of his study, a revolver in his hand, self-inflicted. The Rangers said, chose his own end rather than face justice. Margaret stood at the edge of the ashes that had been her prison, Dusty beside her. "I thought I'd feel something," she said. "Relief, sadness, anger, but there's just nothing." "Shock," Dusty said. "It'll pass." "Will it?" She turned to him. 6 years of my life, gone, my father's legacy, destroyed. The town thinks I'm a Jezebel who drove my husband to madness. What do I have to show for any of it?" "Your life," he said firmly. "Your freedom. The knowledge that those families he cheated will get justice. That's not nothing." She leaned into him, and they stood there as the wind scattered ashes across the Texas earth. The trial of Matheson's accomplices took weeks. Margaret testified with steady dignity, facing down hostile lawyers and jeering spectators. Some days, Dusty had to clench his fists to keep from defending her honor with violence. But she didn't need defending. Her truth was weapon enough. Carson got 20 years. Others got less. Some fled to Mexico and were never caught. But the conspiracy was broken. The stolen lands returned to their rightful owners. The railroad, embarrassed by the scandal, paid settlements to the affected families. Through it all, Margaret and Dusty lived in a legal twilight, not married but living as such, protected by federal marshals but scorned by respectable society. The newspapers called her the Scarlet Woman of Red Bluff, and him the gunslinger gigolo. They learned to ignore the whispers, the pointed fingers, the doors that closed in their faces. One evening, as the trial neared its end, they sat on the porch of their boarding house, watching the sunset paint the sky crimson. "The prosecutor says we're free to go once I give my final testimony," Margaret said. "Where do we go?" "Wherever you want. Though I hear New Mexico's nice. Lots of space, not many questions. And we just start over, like none of this happened?" "No." Dusty took her hand. "We start fresh, but we take it with us, the good and the bad, make something new from the ashes." She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen since Matheson died. Like a phoenix. If that's what you want to call it, I was thinking more like tumbleweeds, moving on to wherever the wind takes us. Tumbleweeds, she repeated. I like that. No roots to hold us down. The marshal, watching them, cleared his throat. Begging your pardon, but there's a preacher down at the Mexican church says he'll marry you folks. Off the record, like, says he knows you from Red Bluff. They looked at each other. Father Miguel, still fighting the good fight. What do you say? Dusty asked. Want to make an honest man of me? I thought we were going to live in sin. Changed my mind. If we're starting fresh, might as well do it right. They were married that night in a small adobe church, with marshals as witnesses and Father Miguel presiding. He'd traveled all the way from Red Bluff, bringing news that the town was slowly healing, slowly changing. You planted seeds of courage, he told Margaret. Others are finding their voices now. The town will survive, perhaps even thrive without its tyrant. Margaret wore a simple dress borrowed from the boarding house owner. Dusty had managed to find a clean shirt. There were no flowers, no music, no guests beyond their protectors. But when Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, when Dusty kissed his bride, the humble church felt like a cathedral. They left Austin the next morning, heading west in a wagon loaded with supplies and hope. The marshals escorted them to the territory border, then turned back with handshakes and well wishes. You know there's still a price on our heads, Margaret said as they watched the marshals disappear. Carson has friends. They might come looking. Let them come, Dusty said. I'm done running, done hiding. We've got the law on our side now. The law? She laughed, but not bitterly. Strange to think that means something again. They made camp that night under stars that seemed to stretch forever. Margaret lay in Dusty's arms, listening to coyotes sing in the distance. Do you regret it? She asked. Your quiet life, your solitude. I took all that from you. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. You didn't take anything. You gave me a reason to rejoin the living. Before you, I was just going through the motions, waiting to die. Now, he gestured at the vast landscape around them. Now I want to see what's over every horizon. With you. She kissed him then, deep and sure, when they made love under those endless stars. It was as husband and wife, free and legal, with no shadows hanging over them except those they cast themselves. They were 2 days into New Mexico territory when they found it, a valley green with cottonwoods, bisected by a clear stream, good grass for horses, shelter from winter winds, far enough from any town to discourage casual visitors. Here, Margaret said suddenly, this is the place. Dusty pulled up the wagon, looking around. You sure? I'm sure. She climbed down, walked to the stream, cupped the clear water in her hands. We could build something here, not an empire like Reed wanted, just a home, a life. He joined her by the water, seeing what she saw, a small house under the cottonwoods, a garden, maybe some cattle, definitely horses, children playing by the stream. The thought ambushed him, filling his chest with terrifying hope. It won't be easy, he warned. Building from nothing never is. I'm not afraid of hard work. She smiled at him, and in her eyes he saw the future stretching out like a promise. Besides, we're not starting from nothing. We're starting from love. That's more than most folks get. He pulled her close, and they stood there by the stream that would water their crops and their dreams. Behind them lay Austin and ashes. Blood and justice served. Ahead lay only what they chose to build. Home, Dusty said, tasting the word. I like the sound of that. Margaret laughed. The sound bright as water over stones. Home, she agreed. As the sun set on their first day in the valley, they began unloading the wagon. There was work to do, shelter to build, land to clear, a life to create from raw possibility. But for the first time in years, perhaps in their lives, they faced the labor with joy rather than duty. They were free. They were together, in a land that broke the weak and buried the proud. They had somehow found each other and survived. That was miracle enough for any lifetime. The stars emerged one by one as they worked, setting up camp for the night. Tomorrow they would begin building. Tonight, they had each other and the promise of all the tomorrows to come. In the wild heart of New Mexico territory, two battered souls began the slow, sweet work of healing. And if sometimes Margaret woke gasping from nightmares, if sometimes Dusty's hand went to his gun at unexpected sounds, well, that was the price of the lives they'd lived. But each dawn came easier than the last. Each shared sunrise a victory over the darkness that had once threatened to consume them. They were tumbleweeds no more. They had found their valley, their stream, their home. And in finding it, they had found themselves, not perfect, not unscathed, but whole in all the ways that mattered. The desert had tested them with fire and blood. They had emerged tempered like steel, strong enough to build something lasting. And in the years to come, when other broken souls found their way to the valley, seeking shelter or second chances, they would find welcome. For Margaret and Dusty knew the value of sanctuary, the power of love to transform even the most damaged hearts. But that was all ahead. For now, there was just this, a man and a woman, a wagon full of dreams, and a valley waiting to become home. The return to Red Bluff came disguised as a cattle drive. 3 years had passed since they'd fled in darkness. 3 years of building their life in the New Mexico Valley. Now Dusty rode at the head of 20 cowboys, driving a herd of 500 head to market. Just another trail boss, weathered by sun and wind, unremarkable except for the way his hand never strayed far from his gun. Margaret waited in Las Cruces, heavy with their second child. Their son, 2-year-old James, stayed with her, too young to understand why his father had to leave, why his mother cried at night when she thought no one was listening. The plan had formed slowly, born of necessity and justice delayed. Word had reached them that Carson had been released early, political favors, money changing hands, the usual corruption. He'd returned to Red Bluff, gathered the remnants of Matheson's organization, and begun where his boss left off. Farmers were being burned out again. The federal marshals, their attention turned elsewhere, did nothing. But Carson had made one mistake. He'd kept the evidence of his crimes, thinking himself untouchable, documents that could hang him, if someone could get to them. Dusty had resisted at first. They had their valley, their peace. Why risk it? But Margaret's arguments wore him down. "Those people helped us," she said. "Father Miguel, the farmers who hid us. Can we abandon them now?" So here he was, riding into the town that had nearly killed them both, with cowboys who didn't know his real purpose and backup that might not come in time. Red Bluff had changed. New buildings lined the main street, the railroad having brought prosperity despite the scandals. But underneath the fresh paint, Dusty sensed the old rot. Carson's men lounged outside the saloon, watching every stranger with predator eyes. Dusty kept his hat low, let his beard grow wild. He was just another trail boss, here to sell cattle and move on. But his eyes mapped every detail. The new sheriff, clearly in Carson's pocket, the fear in merchants' faces, the way people hurried past certain alleys. He made camp outside town with his outfit, playing his role. But that night, he slipped away to meet his contact, Tom Henderson, the farmer whose land Matheson had tried to steal. The man had aged 10 years in 3, his face carved by worry and loss. "Carson's worse than Matheson," Henderson whispered in the darkness of his barn. "Matheson at least pretended to be civilized. Carson doesn't bother. He took the widow Martinez's farm last month. She couldn't prove ownership after her papers burned. The evidence I need? You're sure it exists? My boy works at the bank. Does the cleaning. He's seen Carson's private office, the safe where he keeps his records. But it's guarded day and night." Dusty nodded. "The town meeting tomorrow night. Carson will be there. Has to be. He's announcing his run for mayor. Wants to make it official, like..." They parted with plans half-formed. Hope fragile as spun glass. Dusty returned to his camp, where his cowboys slept unaware of the storm brewing. The next day passed slowly. Dusty conducted his cattle business, all the while studying the town's rhythms. He spotted 2 of Carson's men following him, clumsy as bulls in their surveillance. Let them watch. They'd see nothing but a trail boss spending his profits. That evening, as the town gathered for the meeting, Dusty made his move. The bank sat empty save for one guard, half drunk and bored. Dusty approached from the alley, silent as his Apache teachers had shown him years before. The guard never saw him coming. A quick blow with the gun butt, and the man crumpled. Dusty dragged him into the shadows, took his keys. Inside, the bank was tomb quiet. Dusty found Carson's office. The safe Henderson had described. The lock was good, but not good enough. Years of desperate living had taught him many skills. The safe opened to reveal a treasure trove of corruption, deeds, contracts, records of bribes and murders commissioned, but also something unexpected. Letters from Margaret. No, letters to Margaret, in Carson's crude hand. Recent dates, threats and promises, offering money for information about her location, promising he'd find her eventually. Rage flooded through Dusty, hot and dangerous. He'd known Carson was a threat, but this was personal. The man was hunting his family. He stuffed the documents into a satchel, relocked the safe. Time to go. But as he turned, voices echoed from the front entrance. "Told you I saw someone sneaking around? Check the office. Boss wants to make sure nothing's disturbed before tomorrow. No time for stealth." Dusty went through the window in a shower of glass, hit the ground running. Shouts erupted behind him. A gun fired, the bullet whining past his ear. He ran through the dark streets, using every twist and turn to his advantage. But Carson's men knew the town better. They were hurting him, he realized, pushing him toward the old warehouse district. The trap closed at Matheson's burned mansion. They'd rebuilt parts of it, Carson's new headquarters, rising from the ashes like a mockery of justice. Dusty found himself surrounded. Guns pointed from every direction. Carson emerged from the shadows, bigger than Dusty remembered, face marked by prison scars. Well, Dusty McKenna. Figured it might be you when my boys reported a trail boss asking too many questions. "Carson," Dusty kept his voice level, calculating odds. "Heard you got out early. Good behavior." Carson laughed. "Good money. More like, you know how it is." His eyes glittered. "Where is she? McKenna. Where's my old boss's wife?" "Dead. Fever took her 2 winters back." "Liar." Carson stepped closer. "I know she's alive. Know you married her, too. Very touching. The murderer and the adulteress. Playing house somewhere." "Let it go. Carson, Matheson's dead. That life is over." "Over?" Carson's voice rose. "I spent 3 years in prison because of you two. 3 years!" "You think that's over?" He calmed himself with a visible effort. "But I'm a reasonable man. Tell me where she is, and I'll make it quick. Fight me, and I'll find her anyway. Only she'll wish she died in that creek." The standoff stretched taut. Dusty's hand hovered near his gun, but 8 weapons tracked his every breath. No way to fight clear, but maybe. "She's in California," he said finally. "San Francisco. I can give you the address." Carson's eyes narrowed. "You'd sell her out? Just like that?" "I'm tired of running, tired of looking over my shoulder. You want her, not me. Let me go, and she's yours." For a moment, Carson seemed to consider it. Then he smiled, cold as winter steel. "Nice try, but you're not the type to turn—" "No, you'll tell me where she is." "All right, but only after we've had a conversation. A long, painful conversation." They closed in, and Dusty knew this was it. 3 years of peace, ended by his own foolish need to help. Margaret would wait in Las Cruces, never knowing what became of him. His children would grow up with only stories. The first shot came from above. One of Carson's men spun and fell. Then another. Chaos erupted as more gunfire rained from the rooftops. "It's a trap!" someone shouted. But it wasn't Dusty's trap. Through the confusion came riders, cowboys from his outfit, led by his segundo, a grizzled veteran named Walsh. "Thought you might need help, boss," Walsh called out. "Lever-action rifle spitting fire. Boys didn't much like the idea of you riding into trouble alone." The fight was brief but vicious. Carson's men, caught in the open, scattered or fell. Dusty drew and fired. his shots finding their marks with deadly precision. When the smoke cleared, 5 men lay dead or dying. Others had fled into the night. Carson himself was down, gut shot and gasping. Dusty knelt beside him, no pity in his heart. Where is she?" Carson wheezed. "Safe from you," Dusty said. "That's all that matters. Others will come, money on your heads. Let them come." Dusty stood. "We'll be ready." Carson died with a curse on his lips. Around them, Red Bluff was waking to the sound of gunfire. People emerged cautiously, saw the bodies. The cowboys with their rifles. Sheriff Paulson arrived, took in the scene with calculating eyes. "What happened here?" Dusty tossed him the satchel of documents. "Justice. Long overdue. These papers prove Carson was behind the murders. The land grabs, all of it. Do your job. Sheriff or the federal marshals will do it for you." The sheriff opened the satchel, scanned the papers. His face went pale. "This is Lord Almighty. Clean up your town." Dusty said, "Or next time, we won't be so gentle." He turned to his cowboys, these men who'd risked their lives for him without knowing the full story. "Mount up, boys. We've got cattle to drive." As they rode out, Father Miguel stepped from the shadows of his church. The old priest raised his hand in blessing. Dusty touched his hat brim in response. They drove the cattle hard for 3 days, putting distance between themselves and Red Bluff. Only when they'd crossed into New Mexico did Dusty tell his men the truth. Who he was. Why Carson had wanted him dead. Walsh spat tobacco juice. Figured it was something like that. Man doesn't hire on cowboys who can shoot like us boys can unless he's expecting trouble. "I put you all at risk." "Our choice," another cowboy said. "Besides, been a while since we had a good fight. Getting soft, pushing cattle." Dusty felt something ease in his chest. These men, drifters and outcasts like himself, had become something more, a family of choice, bound by shared danger and mutual respect. They reached Las Cruces to find Margaret waiting at the hotel, worry etched on her face. When she saw him riding in, she ran to meet him, propriety forgotten. "I heard there was shooting in Red Bluff," she said, searching his face. "I thought—" "It's done," he told her, dismounting and pulling her close. "Carson's dead. The evidence is with the law. It's finally done." She wept then, 3 years of fear flowing out in tears. James toddled over, arms raised. "Papa, Papa, home!" Dusty scooped up his son, held his family close. Around them, his cowboys dismounted, suddenly interested in their horses' hooves or the fascinating hotel architecture. That night, after the children were asleep, Dusty gave Margaret the letters he'd found. She read them by lamplight, face paling. "He was looking for us all this time. Not anymore. And if others come, we'll be ready." He took her hands. "We don't have to run. We don't have to hide. The valley is our home, and we'll defend it." She nodded slowly. "The men, they'll stay. Some will. Others will drift on. But there'll always be those who need work, who need a place. We can offer both. So, a different kind of empire," she mused, "built on trust instead of fear." Something like that. They returned to their valley with half the cowboys, the others taking their pay and heading for new horizons. But Walsh and 3 others stayed, building their own cabins, becoming part of the growing community. As summer turned to fall, Margaret gave birth to their daughter. They named her Faith, for that was what had brought them through. Faith in each other, in justice, in the possibility of redemption. The threats came, as Carson had promised, bounty hunters, glory seekers, men who thought a woman and a has-been gunslinger would be easy prey. They learned otherwise. The valley had become a fortress of loyalty, its defenders united by shared purpose. One evening, as the first snows dusted the mountains, Dusty found Margaret standing by the stream where they'd first decided to build their home. Their children played nearby, watched over by Walsh's wife. for even that old warrior had found love in this place of second chances. "Any regrets?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "No," she said simply. "Every scar, every nightmare, every bullet, they all led here, led to this." She turned in his arms. "I'd do it all again, even the parts that hurt. Especially those. They taught me to fight, taught me to value what we have." A rider appeared on the ridge, one of their sentries, waving the all clear. Just checking in, making sure the valley stayed safe. It was a routine that had become comfortable, necessary. "Do you think we'll ever have true peace?" Margaret asked. "A time when we don't need guards?" "Maybe, maybe not. But we have something better. We have a life worth guarding." She smiled. And in that smile, he saw the girl she'd been, the woman she'd become, the partner she'd chosen to be. "Then let them come," she said, echoing his words to Carson. "We'll be ready." As darkness settled over their valley, they walked back to their home, their children, their chosen family. Behind them, the stream sang its endless song. Ahead, warm light spilled from windows, promising safety and love and all the simple joys that make life worth the fighting. They'd started as victims, become survivors, and emerged as something more, builders of a world where broken people could heal, where love conquered fear, where justice wasn't just a word but a living thing. The West would always be wild. Men like Carson would always exist, but so would places like this valley, and people willing to defend them. And in that balance, rough as it was, lay a kind of peace. The letter from Red Bluff arrived on a cold November morning, carried by a young rider who looked road-weary and nervous. Margaret's hands trembled as she read it aloud in their kitchen, while Dusty cleaned his rifle and their children played with wooden blocks by the fire. "The Federal Circuit Judge is reopening the Matheson case," she read, voice steady despite her pale face. "New evidence has emerged suggesting Margaret Matheson was complicit in her husband's crimes. Her presence is required for questioning." Dusty's hand stilled on the rifle. "It's a trap." "Maybe. But if I don't go, they'll issue a warrant. We'll be fugitives again." She set down the letter, jaw firm with resolve. "I won't live that way. Not anymore." Their return to Red Bluff 2 weeks later was nothing like their desperate flight years before. This time they rode in openly, accompanied by Walsh and 3 other men from their valley. Margaret wore her best dress, chin high, every inch the lady she'd been raised to be. The town had changed again. Where Carson's shadow had fallen, new growth struggled to emerge, but the looks that followed them were the same. Curiosity, hostility, judgment. The Scarlet Woman had returned. They took rooms at the hotel, which nearly refused them until Dusty's cold stare changed the manager's mind. Word spread quickly. By evening, half the town knew Margaret Matheson was back. The hearing was set for 3 days hence. Their lawyer, a young man named Phillips, whom they'd hired from Austin, was optimistic. "The new evidence is flimsy, clearly manufactured. Someone wants to destroy your reputation, Mrs. McKenna." "What's left of it to destroy?" Margaret said with bitter humor. That night, unable to sleep, she stood at their window overlooking the main street. Dusty joined her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Look," she said softly. "The dress shop where I bought my wedding trousseau, the church where we married. His house is gone, but the memories—" "Just memories," Dusty said. "They can't hurt you now." "Can't they?" She turned to him. "They whisper about me in the streets. Call me Jezebel, Black Widow. Worse, they blame me for Reed's death, for Carson's, as if I held the guns myself. You survived? In their minds, that's crime enough." A knock interrupted them. Walsh's voice came through the door. "Boss, we got company. Sheriff's downstairs with a dozen men. Says he needs to talk." They found Sheriff Paulson in the hotel parlor, hat in hand but backed by armed deputies. The man had aged since they'd last met, gray threading his hair. Mrs. McKenna," he said formally. "Mr. McKenna, I'm here to inform you that new testimony has been submitted to the court. 3 witnesses claim to have seen you meeting with known criminals before your husband's death, conspiring against him." "What witnesses?" Phillips demanded. "That'll come out at the hearing. I'm also to inform you that you are not to leave town until this matter is resolved." "House arrest?" Dusty's voice was dangerously quiet. "Protective custody," the sheriff corrected. "For your own safety." Feelings run high about the Matheson matter. After he left, Phillips exploded. "This is outrageous. They can't—" "They can," Margaret said quietly. "And they will. Someone wants me destroyed, and they're using the law to do it." The next 2 days passed intense preparation. Phillips interviewed potential witnesses, but doors closed in his face. Fear still gripped Red Bluff. Though its source had shifted, someone new pulled the strings now. The night before the hearing, Margaret couldn't eat. She paced their room while Dusty watched, concern etched on his weathered face. "I know what they'll say," she said, "that I seduced you into helping me, that I planned Reed's death from the beginning, that I'm a black widow who destroys every man who loves me. Let them say it. We know the truth." "Do we?" She whirled on him. "Sometimes I wonder, did I unconsciously want him dead? When I shot him, there was a moment of pure satisfaction." Dusty caught her hands. "Stop. You defended yourself against a monster. Feeling relief doesn't make you guilty. Tell that to them." She gestured toward the window. "They need someone to blame, and the dead make poor defendants." The courthouse was packed the next morning. Margaret entered on Dusty's arm, wearing severe black that emphasized her pallor. Whispers followed their progress to the defendant's table. Judge Harrison, imported from Houston for impartiality, was a stern man with piercing eyes. He called for order, then began, "This hearing will determine if sufficient evidence exists to charge Margaret McKenna, formerly Matheson, with conspiracy in the crimes of her late husband." The prosecutor, a snake named Bellamy with political ambitions, stood. "Your Honor, we will prove that Margaret Matheson was not the victim she claimed, but an active participant who turned on her partner when convenient." The first witness was Carson's former lieutenant, Tyler Briggs, fresh from prison and eager to deal. He testified that Margaret had met with him secretly, promising payment for removing obstacles to her husband's plans. "That's a lie," Margaret said, half rising before Phillips pulled her down. "You'll have your chance," the lawyer whispered. More witnesses followed. A maid who claimed to have heard Margaret discussing murders with her husband. A banker who swore she'd co-signed fraudulent documents. Each testimony more damning than the last, painting Margaret as Lady Macbeth to Matheson's ambitious king. When court recessed for lunch, Phillips was grim. "They've coordinated their stories well. Someone's behind this, someone with money and influence." "Who?" Dusty demanded. "I don't know, but they want Margaret crucified." The afternoon brought a surprise. Father Miguel appeared, age bowing his shoulders but spirit unbent. He testified to Margaret's true character, the bruises he'd seen, the fear she'd lived in. But Bellamy twisted even this. "Isn't it possible, Father, that a clever woman might inflict injuries on herself to gain sympathy, to lay groundwork for murder?" "Anything is possible," Father Miguel admitted. "But I know what I saw in her eyes. Terror, not calculation." The first day ended with Margaret's reputation in tatters. They returned to the hotel through a gauntlet of hostile faces. Someone threw mud that splattered her skirt. Dusty's hand went to his gun, but Margaret stopped him. "Don't! That's what they want! Proof of our violent nature!" That night, she broke, in the privacy of their room. She sobbed against Dusty's chest, all the strength she'd shown publicly crumbling. "I can't do this! They're rewriting history, making me the villain. And part of me wonders if they're right. Maybe I am poison. Maybe everyone I touch—" "Stop!" Dusty held her tighter. "You're the strongest woman I know. Tomorrow, you tell your truth. Make them see." But morning brought worse news. Phillips met them ashen-faced. "There's a new witness, someone who claims to have documents proving your guilt. They won't say who until they testify." The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. When Bellamy called his mystery witness, the doors opened to admit a woman in expensive mourning clothes, her face hidden by a thick veil. "State your name for the record," Judge Harrison instructed. The woman lifted her veil, revealing a face Margaret knew too well. "Cordelia Matheson. I was Reed Matheson's sister." Margaret's blood turned to ice. Cordelia had been traveling in Europe during the scandal, or so they'd thought. Now she sat in the witness box like an avenging angel, producing letters. "My brother wrote me regularly," she said, voice cultured and convincing. These letters detail how Margaret seduced him, then slowly poisoned his mind against his business partners, how she manipulated him into darker and darker deeds, always keeping her own hands clean. "Objection," Phillips shouted. "Those letters could be forgeries." "I have experts who verified the handwriting," Bellamy said smoothly. Cordelia continued her performance, tears at appropriate moments, painting her brother as a good man corrupted by an evil woman. The crowd ate it up. Their hunger for scandal fed. When Phillips finally got to cross-examine, Cordelia had an answer for everything. Why hadn't she come forward sooner? Grief and shame. Why believe her brother's letters over other evidence? Blood doesn't lie to blood. "One question," Phillips said finally. "Who's paying your hotel bills? Miss Matheson? You claim poverty since your brother's death, yet you arrived in a private rail car." Cordelia's composure cracked slightly. "Friends who believe in justice have supported me." "What friends? Names, please." I don't see how that's relevant." Judge Harrison leaned forward. "Answer the question." "I don't know their names." "The arrangements were made through intermediaries." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Phillips pressed on, but Cordelia stonewalled. Still, damage was done to her credibility. That evening, while Dusty and his men guarded the hotel, Margaret sat with Phillips, going through every document they had. "There must be something," she said desperately. "Some proof that—" A soft knock interrupted. Walsh peered in. "Boss, there's someone here. Says they need to speak to Mrs. McKenna, urgent-like." The visitor was a small, nervous woman Margaret recognized. Mrs. Eliza Gordon, who'd been Cordelia's maid years ago. She clutched a worn carpet bag. "I couldn't stand it anymore," she burst out. "Listening to her lies. Mr. Reed was no saint, and Miss Cordelia knows it." "What do you mean?" Phillips leaned forward. "She wasn't in Europe during the Troubles. She was here, in Texas, at a sanitarium. For her nerves, they said, but really—" She opened her bag, pulled out papers. She'd been stealing from her brother for years, funding her laudanum habit. He found out, threatened to cut her off. These are receipts, bills, proof of her debts. Margaret's hands shook as she examined the documents. "She's doing this for money. Someone's paying her to destroy me. More than that." "Mrs." Gordon said. "I heard her talking to a man last night. Said once you were convicted, she'd inherit everything as Reed's only living relative. The estate's been in legal limbo, but with you declared guilty, she gets it all." Phillips breathed. "The money, the lands that were returned to the farmers, she could reclaim them." They worked through the night, building their case. When court reconvened, Phillips stood with new fire. "Your Honor, we request to recall Cordelia Matheson." Bellamy objected, but Judge Harrison allowed it. Cordelia returned to the stand, wary now. Phillips didn't waste time. He presented the evidence of her debts, her addiction, her presence in Texas during the events she claimed to have missed. Cordelia's composed mask slipped with each revelation. "These are fabrications," she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. "Then you won't mind if we call Dr. Pearson from the Riverside Sanitarium? He's waiting outside." Cordelia went white. I don't feel well. I need—" "Answer the questions. Miss Matheson," Judge Harrison ordered. The truth came out in pieces. Yes, she'd been in debt. Yes, she'd been in Texas. Yes, someone had approached her with an offer. Testify against Margaret. Inherit the estate. Share the profits. "Who?" Phillips demanded. "Who's behind this?" "I don't know." Cordelia was crying now, ugly tears that ruined her careful image. They never gave names, just money and promises. So you lied. You forged those letters. No, the letters. Some were real. I just added things, changed things. They said she was guilty anyway, that I was just helping justice along. The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison pounded his gavel, threatening to clear the room. When order restored, he fixed Cordelia with a stare that could freeze fire. You've perjured yourself in my court. You've attempted to pervert justice for profit. Marshal, arrest this woman. As they led Cordelia away, she shot Margaret a look of pure venom, but it was a defeated venom, the last strike of a defanged snake. Bellamy tried to salvage his case, but the other witnesses crumbled under renewed questioning. Briggs admitted he'd been promised reduced sentences. The maid confessed to being paid. The banker broke down entirely, naming names of those who'd bribed him. By afternoon, Judge Harrison had heard enough. It's clear to this court that a conspiracy exists, not by Margaret McKenna, but against her. This case is dismissed with prejudice. It cannot be brought again. He fixed his gaze on Margaret. Madam, this court apologizes for what you've endured. The real criminals will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The gavel fell with finality. Outside, Red Bluff waited, but the crowd's mood had shifted. Some still glared, but others looked ashamed. A few even nodded respectfully as Margaret passed. Father Miguel waited by their hotel, beaming. Truth will out, he said simply. It always does, given time. That night, their last in Red Bluff, Margaret stood again at the window, but this time, she wasn't looking at the past. She was watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky, thinking of home. It's over, Dusty said, joining her. Really over this time. No, she corrected. It's beginning. Our real life, without shadows chasing us. She turned to him. Can we go home now? Nothing I'd like better. They left that morning, but not alone. Mrs. Gordon came with them, seeking her own fresh start. Two of the farmers whose land had been saved offered to escort them part way. Even Philip shook their hands warmly, promising to visit their valley someday. As Red Bluff faded behind them, Margaret felt something she'd almost forgotten. Lightness, the weight of accusation, of running, of constant fear had lifted. She was just a woman riding beside her husband toward home and children and honest work. No regrets? Dusty asked, echoing his old question. None, she said, and meant it. Every scar brought me here, brought me you, brought me home. The road stretched ahead, leading to their valley where love had conquered fear, where broken people found wholeness, where the wild heart of the West beat in time with their own. Behind them, Red Bluff would remember. Some would speak of the Jezebel who'd destroyed great men. Others would whisper of the woman who'd survived monsters and emerged victorious. Time would blur the facts, legend replacing history. But Margaret didn't care about her place in stories. She had her truth, her family, her freedom, in a land that broke the weak and buried the proud. She'd somehow emerged neither broken nor buried, but tempered like steel in forge fire. The past was finally past. The future waited, bright with promise. And in the present, she rode beside the man she loved toward the life they'd built from ashes and hope. Justice had been served, but more than that, redemption had been earned. Not in any court of law, but in the harder court of conscience, where every soul must eventually stand trial. Margaret Matheson was dead, buried with her brutal husband and his corrupt empire. Margaret McKenna lived, loved, and looked forward to all the tomorrows yet to come. The West would remember her as many things, victim, survivor, symbol, but she would remember herself simply, a woman who refused to break, who found love in desolation, who built something beautiful from the wreckage of something ugly. That was legacy enough for anyone. The news of Reed Matheson's death in prison came on a spring morning 5 years later, carried by a traveling preacher who stopped at their valley seeking water and rest. Margaret received it while hanging laundry, her hands stilling on a wet sheet as the words sank in. Heart failure. The preacher said, sudden-like. They found him in his cell at dawn. Dusty watched his wife's face carefully, but Margaret simply nodded and returned to her work. It wasn't until that evening, after their 3 children were asleep, that she spoke of it. "I thought I'd feel something," she said, staring into their fireplace. "Relief, maybe, or even sadness for the man he could have been. But there's nothing. He's been dead to me so long. This just makes it official." Those 5 years had been kind to them. Their valley had grown into a small community, 6 families now, drawn by the promise of fair work and fresh starts. The ranch prospered, their horse breeding program gaining recognition across the territory. James, now 7, could ride like he was born in the saddle. Faith, 5, had her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn streak. Their youngest, Thomas, toddled after his siblings with determination that made everyone laugh. But now, with Reed officially gone, there was paperwork to consider. Margaret was his legal widow, despite their divorce never being finalized before his death. Letters from lawyers in Austin suggested there might be inheritance issues to resolve. "I don't want anything from that life," Margaret said when Phillips wrote with details. "Let it rot with him." But Dusty disagreed. That money came from honest folks he cheated. Maybe it's time some of it went back to doing good. So they made one final journey to Red Bluff. Children in tow this time. The town had transformed again. The railroad bringing prosperity that Reed Matheson had killed to achieve. New buildings lined the streets, and faces that had once turned away now nodded greeting. They were met at the lawyer's office by an unexpected gathering. Former victims of Matheson's schemes. Farmers and ranchers who'd lost everything and slowly rebuilt. Henderson was there, gray-haired but straight-backed. The widow Martinez, who'd refused to leave her burned land and now ran a successful freight business. Others whose names Margaret barely knew, but whose faces showed the same mixture of loss and survival. "We've been talking," Henderson said without preamble, "about what to do with Matheson's remaining assets. The court says you have first claim, Mrs. McKenna." "I don't want—" "Hear us out," Widow Martinez interrupted. "We're not asking you to take it. We're asking you to help us use it right." Their proposal was simple and brilliant. Create a trust for the displaced, the cheated, the broken. Use Matheson's blood money to help other victims of land grabs and corruption throughout Texas. Build something good from the ashes of something evil. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "He'd hate this, absolutely hate it." "Good," said Henderson firmly. "Then we're on the right track." They spent 3 days in Red Bluff, setting up the trust with Phillips' help. Margaret insisted on one condition. Her name wouldn't be attached. This would be the people's trust, not hers. She'd had enough of being a symbol. On their last evening, they attended church, the same church where Father Miguel had once hidden them, where he'd married them in secret. The old priest was frailer now, but still commanded his pulpit with quiet authority. After the service, he pulled them aside. "I have something for you," he said, producing a wrapped package. "I've been saving it, waiting for the right time." Inside was a photograph, old, slightly faded. Margaret gasped. It showed her parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful, before debt and Reed Matheson had destroyed everything. "How did you—" "Your mother gave it to me years ago, when she sensed the darkness coming. She said to keep it safe. Give it to you when you'd found your way back to happiness." His eyes twinkled. "I believe that time is now." "Yes." Margaret clutched the photograph, seeing her mother's smile, her father's proud stance. They'd made mistakes, been crushed by circumstances, but they'd also loved her. It was enough. That night in their hotel, with the children finally asleep in the adjoining room, Margaret and Dusty stood on the balcony overlooking the town that had been her prison and her crucible. "Strange to think it all started here," she said. "That girl who married Reed, I barely remember her." "I never met her," Dusty replied, pulling her close. "But I'm grateful for her courage. Without it, you'd never have run, never have ended up by that creek. Never have found you." She turned in his arms. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd just ridden past that day? Every blessing I've got came from stopping." He kissed her forehead. "No point wondering about roads not taken." A sound from inside interrupted them. Thomas crying. Margaret went to tend him while Dusty checked on the older children. Simple, domestic moments that would have seemed impossible during those desperate days of running and hiding. They left Red Bluff the next morning, but not alone. 2 families from the meeting had decided to join their valley community, people ready to work hard and start fresh. The wagon train that headed west was larger, louder, filled with children's laughter and women's gossip and men's plans for the future. "We're becoming a proper town," Margaret observed as they made camp the first night. "Does that worry you?" Dusty asked. "No. Towns need law, though. Order. Someone to keep the peace when disputes arise." Dusty was quiet for a long moment. "You saying what I think you're saying. Sheriff McKenna has a nice ring to it. And you've got the experience. I've got experience on the wrong side of the law, which makes you perfect to enforce it. You know all the tricks." He laughed, but she could see him considering. The man who'd run from his past was gone, replaced by someone who understood that redemption meant using your scars to help others heal. Back in their valley, spring bloomed with unusual vigor. The new families settled in, building homes, planting gardens. A 1-room schoolhouse went up, with Mrs. Gordon, who'd become like family, as teacher. On Sundays, they gathered for services led by whoever felt moved to speak. One evening, as summer approached, their peace was interrupted by riders on the horizon. Dusty reached for his rifle, old habits dying hard, but Margaret stopped him. "Look closer," she said. The lead rider was a woman, young, bruised, desperate. Behind her, a family, children clinging to a worn wagon. A man with the hollow look of defeat. They'd heard stories. The woman explained, of a valley where people could start over, where the past didn't define your future. "We've got nothing," the man said. "Lost everything to a land grabber up north, but we can work. We're not afraid of hard labor." Margaret and Dusty exchanged glances. How many times would this scene replay? How many broken souls would find their way here? "There's a spot by the eastern spring," Dusty said finally. "Good soil. You're welcome to it." The woman burst into tears. "We can pay. You'll work," Margaret said firmly. "Contribute to the community. Help the next family that comes looking. That's payment enough." As the years passed, the valley grew. Not a town, exactly. They were too spread out for that. More like a constellation of homes and dreams, connected by shared values and mutual support. Dusty did become sheriff, elected unanimously, keeping peace with wisdom rather than violence. Margaret ran the school alongside Mrs. Gordon, teaching letters and numbers, but also courage and compassion. Their children grew strong and free, unaware that their mother had once been called Jezebel, their father a killer. They knew only the love that surrounded them, the community that raised them, the values of hard work and second chances, sometimes on quiet evenings. Margaret would take out her mother's photograph and the few mementos she'd saved. She'd tell her children stories, edited, softened, but essentially true, about the importance of standing up to bullies, of helping those who couldn't help themselves, of choosing love over fear. "Your father saved me," she'd say, watching Dusty work with the horses through the window. "Like a prince in the fairy tales?" Faith would ask. "No." Margaret would smile. "Like a real person, which is much braver. Princes in stories are perfect. Real people have to choose to be good every day, despite their flaws. That's true courage." One autumn day, a letter arrived that made Margaret's hands tremble. It was from Cordelia, Reed's sister, writing from prison where she was serving time for perjury. The letter was long, rambling, full of justifications and accusations, but at the end, 6 words. "I'm sorry. Can you forgive me?" Margaret stared at those words for a long time. Then she took up her pen and wrote back a single line. "I forgave you long ago. Now forgive yourself." She never heard from Cordelia again, but sometimes wondered if that broken woman had found her own redemption, The West was vast enough for all kinds of salvation. Their valley's reputation spread. McKenna's place, people called it, though they'd never formally named it. A sanctuary for the displaced, the desperate, the determined. Not everyone who came stayed. Some were too broken, some too wedded to old ways. But those who remained built something remarkable, a community based on trust rather than law, on mutual aid rather than individual gain. "We're building what Reed pretended to build," Margaret observed one day, watching children of various families play together by the creek. A real community, real prosperity, built on love instead of fear. Dusty agreed. Makes all the difference. On their 10th wedding anniversary, counting from Father Miguel's secret ceremony, the community threw a celebration. Tables groaned under the weight of shared food. Music filled the air. Children ran wild while adults danced under stars. Father Miguel, ancient now but still spry, had made the journey to officiate at a renewal of their vows. This time, there were no secrets, no shadows, just two people who'd walked through fire and emerged whole, surrounded by the community they'd built from ashes. "Do you, Margaret McKenna, take this man again, knowing all his flaws and graces?" "Every day," she answered, eyes locked on Dusty's weathered face. "In this life and whatever comes after." "Do you, Dusty McKenna, take this woman again, knowing her strength and scars?" "Until the mountains fall," he replied, voice rough with emotion. "And probably after that, too." The celebration lasted until dawn. Stories shared, songs sung, bonds strengthened, as the sun rose over their valley, painting the world in shades of gold and promise. Margaret stood surrounded by all they'd built. The girl who'd married Reed Matheson for duty was long dead. The woman who'd run in terror had transformed. What remained was something harder and softer both. A soul who'd learned that love wasn't just a feeling, but a choice, made daily, in small acts of courage and kindness. "Any regrets?" Dusty asked, finding her watching the sunrise. "Only one," she said, turning to smile at him. "That we didn't find each other sooner. Had to become who we are first," he replied. "That girl and that gunslinger wouldn't have known what to do with this kind of happiness." She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. Around them, their community stirred to life. Chores to do, children to feed, life to live. But for this moment, they stood still. Two souls who'd found home in each other against all odds. The West would continue to be wild. Men like Reed and Carson would always exist, preying on the vulnerable. But so would places like this valley, and people willing to stand against the darkness. In that balance lay hope. As the sun climbed higher, Margaret and Dusty walked back to their home, hand in hand. Behind them, the past lay buried with all its pain. Ahead, the future beckoned with all its possibility. And in the present, they had everything that mattered: love, family, community, and the knowledge that broken things could be made beautiful with enough patience and faith. The desert had tested them with everything it had: violence, betrayal, loss, judgment. They'd survived it all and built something the wasteland rarely saw, a place where love was stronger than fear, where second chances bloomed like wildflowers after rain, where the human heart proved tougher than any landscape. Their story would be told around campfires for generations, twisted and embellished until legend replaced fact. But the truth was both simpler and more profound. Two damaged people had chosen to heal together, and in healing, had created a sanctuary for others seeking the same grace. In the end, that was the greatest revenge against men like Reed Matheson, not violence or retribution, but the simple act of building something better from the rubble they left behind. Love had conquered fear. Hope had outlasted despair. And in a valley that had once known only wind and loneliness, a community thrived on the radical notion that everyone deserved a second chance. The Wild West had tried to break them. Instead, they'd helped tame it, not with guns or laws, but with the most dangerous weapon of all: compassion. And in that victory lay a truth as old as the mountains and as enduring as the stars: love. Real love, the kind forged in hardship and tempered by choice, could survive anything, even the wild, wild West. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Friends, I hope you enjoyed following Margaret and Dusty's journey through the untamed frontier. If you're listening to this tale right now, drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with fellow Western story enthusiasts. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more authentic tales of love, redemption, and survival in the American frontier. Share your thoughts about Margaret and Dusty's story in the comments. Which moment touched your heart the most? Until we meet again on the dusty trails of another tale, keep riding toward your own horizons. Happy trails, partners.